Where in the Old Testament does it say that the instruments were covered in blood? Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm so glad you asked, because this is a favorite topic of mine, and this is a sort of a Reformed view or understanding that we have lost in the modern period. Not many people are aware that we used to teach this regularly. We used to interpret 2 Chronicles 29 this way and draw inferences. And if you do a search, you won't find any such expression or any sentence that says that the instruments are covered in blood. That is an inference. It's a colorful way of trying to help people realize that the instruments were an integral part of the types and shadows. And the ancient Christian view, going back to the 2nd century, and the Reformation view, particularly the Reformed view, not the Lutheran view, but the Reformed view from the earliest days of the Reformation until, well, probably it began to really seriously break down in the 19th century. And, in the Dutch, for example, in the Christian Reformed Church, they didn't add or permit organs, I don't think, until 1930s, maybe. I remember reading in R.B. Kuyper's As to Being Reformed, which was published sometime in the 1920s, where an elder was complaining to Kuyper, and I think an organ had been installed maybe at 7th Reformed, which was RCA in Grand Rapids in the 20s, and an elder was complaining. But I could be wrong about where it was installed. But in some Reformed church, and he called it Dagon, I think he said something about the organ being Dagon, and Kuyper did not think much of that comment. I wouldn't say it was Dagon, but I understand why the layman, maybe elder, said what he said to Kuyper, and I'm probably now, in 2024, a little closer to that layman or that elder than I am to Kuyper on that question. Now, when I read it in the 1980s, probably 88 or something like that, I remember thinking I was with Kuyper and sort of in my heart, mocking the man who asked the question or made the objection. But the more I've learned about the history of Christian worship and the more I've learned about the history of Reformed worship, so, broadly Christian, going back to the fathers, and particularly the history of Reformed worship, I've come to think differently. My sympathies have changed. So 2 Chronicles 29, I won't read all of it, but I'll kind of walk through it with you and give you a sense of how we used to read this. So let's look at 2 Chronicles 29, and I'll read a little bit at the beginning and then summarize and comment a little bit, and then we'll pick up the reading in detail, starting in verse 20. But 2 Chronicles 29:29, Hezekiah began to reign when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. This is from the English Standard Version, by the way. His mother's name was, and I think it's usually pronounced Abijah, is what I've heard, but I think probably better Abijah, and sometimes Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And you'll notice the small caps there, so that stands for Yahweh, according to all that David, his father, had done. And then just summarizing verses 3 through 19, you see that in the first year of his reign, he opened the doors of the house of Yahweh and repaired them. He brought in the priests and the Levites and assembled them in the square on the east and said to them, "Hear me, Levites, now consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of Yahweh, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place." So this is the cleansing of the temple. This is the reformation of worship under the types and shadows. Notice who's doing this. It's Levites. What do Levites do? They offer sacrifices. What happens when Levites offer sacrifices? There is bloodshed, and bloodshed is integral to the types and shadows pointing forward to Christ. And anyway, we'll sort of pass by the rest of it till we get to verse 20, which is material to the question that David asked. Then Hezekiah the king rose early and gathered the officials of the city and went up to the house of Yahweh. And they brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats for a what? A sin offering for the kingdom and for the sanctuary and for Judah. And he commanded the priests, the sons of Aaron, to offer them on the altar of the Lord. So they slaughtered the bulls, and the priests received the blood and threw it against the altar. And they slaughtered the rams, and their blood was thrown against the altar. And they slaughtered the lambs, and their blood was thrown against the altar. Then the goats for the sin offering were brought to the king and the assembly, and they laid their hands on them, and the priests slaughtered them, and made a sin offering with their blood on the altar to make atonement for all Israel. For the king commanded that the burnt offering and the sin offering should be made for all Israel. So, verses 20 through 24, you see Levites who are ordained by God to sacrifice animals, to shed blood for the ritual of forgiveness of sins and atonement and so forth. So, bloodshed offerings are a basic part of biblical worship, right? Jewish worship under the types and shadows, looking forward. And who's doing it? It's Levites, right? That's important. And maybe we don't think about that. And then look at verse 25. And he stationed the Levites again, the priestly class, set aside by God, ordained to do this very thing, in the house of Yahweh with what? Cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the commandment of David and of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan, the prophet. Now listen to this. For the commandment was from the Lord, from Yahweh, through his prophets. So this is divinely ordained, divinely sanctioned use of musical instruments in the worship of God. By whom? The priests. Who did what? Who sacrificed animals, who threw blood of animals against the altar. And so when I say that the musical instruments of the types and shadows are covered with the blood of bulls and goats, obviously that's a little hyperbole, and it's a metaphor, it's a figure of speech. They're not literally covered with blood, but my point is to try to help you, the listener, and the reader, understand that the same class of people who sacrificed animals by divine ordination were also playing musical instruments in the worship of God by divine ordination. And we don't offer animals anymore in our worship, not in a genuine Christian worship service. Any ostensible Christian worship service that offered animal sacrifices would be grossly out of touch with the teaching of Scripture. And that would be an abomination. And it would be an abomination because the book of Hebrews tells us that all those sacrifices are finished. Well, we don't have any more Levites. Right? Those priests died, and they had to make offering for their own sins. And that priesthood has been superseded by the Melchizedekian priesthood. And that's what chapter 7 says, 11 through 14. The law changed, says Hebrews, because the priesthood changed. And the whole law, the whole system, the whole Mosaic system, he's saying, rested upon the priesthood. And when the priesthood changed, the law changed. Or in other words, we're not under the Mosaic system anymore. The old covenant system, again, if you pay attention to Hebrews 7, 8, 9, and 10, and if you pay attention to 2 Corinthians 3, the old covenant, Palaios diatheke, is consistently equated with Moses. So that's why Hebrews says that it all rested on the priesthood. And the priesthood has changed. And we have a priesthood that can never die, an eternal, unchangeable priesthood in Jesus Christ. Now, that's why we don't make any bloody offerings anymore, because all those things have been fulfilled. If the bloody offerings have been fulfilled, and if the bloody offerings were made by Levites, and if the bloody offerings were part of the types and shadows, that's why we don't observe those things anymore. How is it that we're able to, as it were, extract the musical instruments, the cymbals, the harps, the lyres, right? L-Y-R-E-S, these are stringed instruments. How is it that we're able to extract them from that same period of types and shadows? Now, listen again to what verse 26 says. The Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah commanded that the burnt offering be offered on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord, to Yahweh, also began, and the trumpets accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. The whole assembly worshipped, and the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. That's verse 28, verse 29. When the offering was finished, the king and all who were present with him bowed themselves and worshipped. Hezekiah, the king, and the officials commanded the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph, the seer. And they sang praises with gladness, and they bowed down and worshipped. And then verse 31, right? Hezekiah said, you have now consecrated yourselves to Yahweh. Come near, bring sacrifices and thank offerings to the house of Yahweh. And the assembly brought sacrifices and thank offerings, and all who were of a willing heart brought burnt offerings. Now, again, think about the movement of redemptive history. Where are we? We're in the new covenant. We're in the time of fulfillment. And what does the New Testament tell us to do? Well, it tells us to make melody in our hearts, right? And we are to sing, we are to praise, but there's no evidence whatever that the New Testament church used instruments. And we know they didn't sacrifice animals, and we know that the distinction between clean and unclean animals was done away with. We see that in Acts chapter 10. So all those types and shadows have been fulfilled. And so the ancient church concluded that those animals, right, and the instruments that were connected with them were all part of a package of typological illustrations, foreshadowings of the coming reality of Jesus Christ and the new covenant. And so when the reformers had a chance to cleanse the church, one of the first things they did was to get rid of the musical instruments, typically an organ. And not all the churches had organs, but by the early to mid-16th century, a number of them had come to have organs, and they were removed. In the 17th century, the Westminster Divines had the organ taken out of St. Paul's and burned in the streets of London, and they referred to it, or one of the divines in a letter referred to it as trinkets. And I think there were probably other things that were burned as well. And organs were removed from churches all over. They were removed in Heidelberg, and they were moved in other places. Now, there were civil authorities that liked them, and some of the people liked them, and particularly some particular notable people, significant people, important people, wealthy people probably liked them in the Netherlands. And so there was a struggle in the 16th and 17th centuries between the ministers who tended to want to get rid of the organs and important laity and civil officials. And remember, these are state churches, and so the civil officials had something to say about what happened in the church and how things were done. And so there was a struggle. And eventually the churches or the ministers lost that fight, and the people, in a sense, won. And the people simply didn't care that the organs, musical instruments, were part of the types and shadows. They liked them. And so this is the challenge. And today, of course, everyone has musical instruments in the church. And so when I tell you that the ancient church didn't have them, and that the early Reformed churches for most of 200 years didn't have them in most places, it seems sort of crazy or implausible or unlikely, but it's a fact. And so I'm asking you, listener, to ask yourself, well, how is it that we can say, on the one hand, that, well, we don't sacrifice animals anymore because, well, that was part of the types and shadows, but it's okay to have musical instruments. The same people who were sacrificing animals were also playing musical instruments. And as I say, there's no evidence. In fact, it's almost certain, 99.9% certain, that the Apostolic Church used no musical instruments. We know they sang psalms, and we know they sang, and we know the early second century church, they're very explicit. They did not use musical instruments. And as a matter of history, there were no instruments in the church until Well, traditionally, I think sometime in the 8th century is when the Reformed used to say that the first organ was introduced under Pope Vitalian in Spain. So one organ in the 8th century was permitted. Now, as a matter of history, some scholars have revised that and actually pushed the date backward into, I think, the 11th century. So organs were, and musical instruments generally, were not used hardly at all in Christian worship for 1,000 years. So that even in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, when he comments on it, describes it as Judaizing, by which he means going backwards in redemptive history, back to the types and shadows. So how is it that Thomas understood how to read the history of redemption better than we do in Presbyterian and Reformed churches in 2024?